and other luminaries from the Vedanta and non-dual traditions, and actually not only do that, but relate that to modern science, insights into the nature of reality, fundamental reality, as opposed to perceptual experience, and what it means to move into higher states of consciousness. So right now, if you look at the scientific literature on consciousness, it's mostly neuroscience. How does the brain produce experience? And of course, the brain is involved in producing experience, but the brain itself is also an experience. And that's where yoga takes us to a deeper understanding of what we call reality. So with that, I'd just like to start with a couple of definitions. And we will start with the help of the great Yogi Raj, Eddie Stern. So Eddie, we are calling this course Yoga for Enlightenment. Give me your take on yoga and what it means. What is the meaning of yoga? Since everybody's familiar with the word and they think it's going to a studio and doing asanas and pranayam, which is a very important part of yoga. But I'd love to hear your definition of yoga, the classic definition, and also your personal understanding of what it means to be enlightened, what the term enlightened means, because our course is called Yoga for Enlightenment, a course for modern adepts. What is yoga?
Okay, well, a pretty big question. And first of all, thanks for your kind introduction, but I'm hardly a Yogi Raj. I'm a student and practitioner, and that's it. So, it's funny, about a week or so ago, someone wanted to interview me for their master's dissertation for yoga philosophy course at Loyola. And she said, I just very simply want to know, what's your understanding of what the word yoga means? And I thought about it for a little while, and I wrote her back and I said, I'm not too sure if my ideas about yoga are all that relevant. I think what's more important is try to understand what were the ancient texts trying to say yoga was. And so most of my time is spent trying to get an idea of what are the texts saying about yoga, try to understand that, and then put those things into practice. So from a Patanjali, so for those who don't know who Patanjali was a rishi or a sage who lived somewhere around 200 to 400 CE. And he codified all of the teachings of yoga that were existing up till that point when he lived. So the yoga in the Hindu tradition and in the entire South Asian subcontinent isn't so much like a thing as it is a dialogue. And it's a dialogue about the nature of reality, the nature of consciousness, what is enlightenment, who am I, what's the purpose, all these types of things. So this is the conversation that you and I are having now has been going on since thousands and thousands of years ago, like, 10,000 years before, the Common Era. And so yoga fits into that dialogue, and Patanjali came into it, sort of at a midway point of where we are now, like we're, say, 2,000 years or so after Patanjali, and the yoga conversation was going 2,000 or 3,000 or 4,000 years before he was born. So he took that whole dialogue and he condensed it into 196 short little aphorisms or sutras that we'll be discussing. And he said that yoga is a very specific thing. It is the nirodha, or the cessation or the controlling of the vrittis, the activities that are occurring in the field of chitta, which is something like mind. And what we want to do in the practice of yoga is begin to selectively eliminate all of those activities that are other than who we truly are. And then when we remove all of those activities of not us, of something of otherness, then all that's left is pure being, is the self, is who we are. So yoga as a practice is the selective elimination of the activities that hold us to identifying as something other than pure being, other than consciousness. And as a state, it is a state of oneness, a state, or actually Patanjali didn't say oneness ever. He said it's a state of the self being the self alone, and that's all. So from a Patanjali point of view, what is enlightenment? Enlightenment is when the self remains as the self alone and not as anything else. And what is non-enlightenment? When the self is identifying with something other than its own self. So that's the perspective I kind of am looking at it from.
Well, that's very useful, Eddie. What you've stated is in English exactly what Patanjali said. And it's very beautiful, and it's rings true. Since our audience is not necessarily familiar with Patanjali, let me phrase those two definitions, rephrase them, and see if they're adequate from your point of view, okay? So from my readings, the word yoga is related to the English word also, yoke, which means union. And therefore, yoga is union with the source of all experience, which you call the self. And part of the training of the yogi towards enlightenment, as I understand, is being one with the source of all experience, which is awareness or consciousness, pure consciousness. So yoga is a methodology or a process through which we find union with the self, which is the source of all experience. But we do so by cutting the veil of ignorance through yogic practice. The veil of ignorance is not really necessarily other than the self. It's a modified, mutable expression of the self, ceaselessly changing, but still an expression of the self. So everything that we call the veil of ignorance, the vrittis, the fluctuations of consciousness, that veil the purity of the source, but are still actually aspects of the self. These vrittis are, of course, generated in the self, experienced in the self, known in the self. So they are also the self in a sense, except they are the mutable self. And by cutting the veil of ignorance, we get to the immutable self. Is that pretty much the same understanding as you gave me through the direct translation of the Yoga Sutras of Patanjali?
Yeah, I think this would be an Advaita Vedanta perspective on yoga. Absolutely. Okay. And so what you were basically saying, and I love how you can put all these things into contemporary terms as well, and also speak so much slower than I do. I have to learn how to do that from you. That that all experience, that everything basically is an experience. Even consciousness is an experience, and that there are modifications of that experience that sometimes seem to be separate from all that is. And we easily identify with those separate experiences and then hold on to that as a story, forgetting who we, that we actually are part of everything. So, and then Patanjali is operating from a slightly different perspective, that there's something called nature and there's something called consciousness. And both of those are eternal realities. They both exist. And how there are two things that could exist, I don't know. Probably the same way there's one thing that could exist. And nature, as an eternal principle, either is at rest in a perfect equilibrium, or it begins to move and fold into patterns or modulations, as you like to say. And then as those patterns ripple over each other, those form the infinite potential for experience. And then when experience has served its purpose, it dissolves back into the equilibrium. And then the self just remains as a self. But when nature moves, the self remains as nature, as the changing veils, as you said, or something similar to Maya. There are later versions of Sankhya that are closer to Advaita Vedanta, where you have sort of like a unity consciousness, and then subcategories of that are consciousness and nature, but they're really all part of one thing, and they're only divided apart for the sake of investigation. So it all depends on what time period that you're talking in.
I see.
So, but I think for the purpose of what we're investigating, without hair splitting between philosophies, that yes, I think that's a very good model for us to follow, especially in this age of, of all the investigation you've done on qualia and quanta, and it fits into that model very, very well.
Okay, so with that little bit of introduction, why don't we go directly to Patanjali? I believe the first sutra in Patanjali is just now the teaching of yoga begins, or something like that.
Yeah.
What is the exact sutra?
It is Atha Yoga Anushasanam. So
Okay.
Atha means now.
Mhm.
Yoga is, of course, yoga as you've defined it. And Anushasanam means a systematic explanation. The word shash is also the verbal root for discipline. So Patanjali is presenting a systematic discipline of practice within all of the following sutras. And as well, quite often in the Hindu tradition, the first word of a text will determine basically what the topic is going to be. So in Bhagavad Gita, which is a text or a revealed scripture basically about dharma and behavior, the first word of the Gita is dharma. Dharma kshetre kuru kshetre. And for the Rig Veda, Agni is the first word. Agnimile purohitam. And so everything in the Rig Veda harnesses itself on the power of Agni, on the witness consciousness, the potential for transformation. And so in Yoga Sutra, the first word is Atha, which means now. So that's what we're basically going to be talking about. What is the now? What is the eternal now?
And then the second sutra is Yoga Chit Vritti Nirodha.
Yes.
Yoga is the quietening down of the vrittis, the fluctuations of awareness or consciousness that we call the mind, and till the fluctuations subside in the vast, unbounded, formless, infinite, irreducible ocean of consciousness, which is our source, the source of all experience, the source of the universe, literally. Right?
How would you define chitta? Like chitta is like a portion of, and chit is consciousness. So, but and it's quite often translated as mind. But what would your take on chitta be in relation to this sutra?
I would say chit vritti nirod. So chitta is, in my understanding, awareness or consciousness, and vrittis are the fluctuations of consciousness that we call the mind. But these fluctuations include everything that we call sensations, perceptions, images, feelings, and thoughts. So vritti is basically disturbance of pure awareness that is experienced as the mind. If by mind we mean that domain of modified awareness, not pure awareness, which gives us the experience of sense perceptions, physical sensations, images, feelings, thoughts, which is basically, if I was to use an acronym, it would be SIFT, S-I-F-T, which is all experience. I can't think of any other experience outside of SIFT: sensations, sense perceptions, images, feelings, thoughts. So this is, right now, I'm experiencing sensations, images, feelings, thoughts. So are you. And everything that we are experiencing, the objects in my room, the paintings, the books, and the computer, the screen, and all the people in cyberspace who are participating with us across the world in maybe over 100 countries. we are all part of shared vritti. And that now shared vritti is in what we would call cyberspace. But these are modern terms. Cyberspace is the shared cognitive and perceptual space that we're sharing right now. And the technology that we have has actually expanded our ability to share this space, cognitive and perceptual space. So I would say that what we're experiencing right now, and people who are watching us, are shared, entangled vrittis. Now, this is very interesting because these vrittis are entangled. If I say something joyful right now, or even send, as we are speaking, I send you an emoticon through the same shared cyberspace, you might get a dopamine hit, or you might get an oxytocin hit. So we can see directly right now from this conversation that the vrittis are not only shared in the ecosystem of human experience, the vrittis are shared in the ecosystem of human experience, but they actually modulate each other's experiences too. If I said something rude to you, you might, instead of getting a dopamine hit, you might secrete adrenaline or cortisol, which might influence your immune system. If you make too much cortisol, it might compromise your immune system. If you make good amounts of dopamine, you might start to regulate your immune system. So the vritti is actually being shared experience in shared cognitive and perceptual space are in fact creating our collective experience of reality right now, what we call reality. But it's not reality, it's a modified form of reality. Reality as absolute reality is chitta, or pure consciousness, which has its own qualities. It's unpredictable, it's formless, it's irreducible, it is infinite, it self-regulates, it self-organizes, it evolves, it's unstoppable, it is immutable, but its fluctuations are what give rise to the experience that we call mind, body, ultimately body, because the body itself is a changing perceptual activity. It's part of SIFT. So the body is the mind. And also the world, that which we call the world, is a perceptual activity. So the world, the physical body, and the mind are a unified entanglement of vrittis in an absolute consciousness. The vrittis themselves may be fragmented and separate, but they too are entangled ultimately, because if I have one vritti, let's say thought, mother, okay, and I do this regularly before I go to sleep at night, I think of my mother who's long passed. But as soon as I think of her, I see an image. As soon as I see an image, I feel an emotion, I feel love. Then if I want, in my subtle body, I can actually experience by lying in her lap as a little kid and smelling her skin. I mean, I can smell her skin. She left this world 20 years ago. I can, in my subtle body, experience her smell. I can listen to her voice, what she sounded. I can feel the emotions. Where is that happening? It's vrittis. Now, when I share that with you, you might have your own vrittis about mother and your own ideas and people who are listening. So actually the vrittis are also entangled, and they create ultimately the human universe, the human experience of the universe. But of course, there are vrittis that other sentient beings have. Other, from mosquitoes to whales to dolphins to eagles to lizard, they're all biological organisms which are the expressions of vritti. And so chit vritti nirodh to me actually means going to the source of the universe, which is what Vedanta says. Atman is Brahman, but the jiva is that part of Atman which has taken a particular route, a particular karmic root, a story. And, the Buddhists call this the pain body or the body karmic body. And then we have the bliss body, which is independent of the vrittis. And the bliss body then is part of the bliss body of Brahman, which is the universe. So chit vritti nirod, just that one phrase is actually telling us the mechanics of creation of the entire universe.
Yeah, beautifully said. Absolutely. And in fact, in Sanskrit, this is called the Lakshana Sutra. This is the defining characteristic of the entire text. So it is all contained in there, and everything else is just explanation.
That's beautiful. So given that, let's, I have, our audience is at every level. People are beginners, and then there are people who know at least much more than I do, not maybe as much as you do. But since we are on this course, I think every time we share these ideas, it'll be good to give them a little list of the words we are using and the meanings, okay? You've already defined atha. We've talked about yoga. We've talked about chitta. Vritti, nirod means quietening. And so we have in this first few insights into the nature of yoga, some other words that you have used in your teachings. Swarupa. So atha, yoga, chitta, vritti, nirodha, and then swarupa. Swarupa to me means form or experience of a form. Is that correct?
Yes. So after yoga, chitta, vritti, nirodha, which you beautifully explained, and I also really like how you made it clear that vrittis they're influenceable. Or they can be influenced, and very easily too, with a kind word or with a harsh word or with a thoughtful action. And if we think about vrittis as only being thoughts, and we already don't know what our mind is, it can be frustrating to try to control something that we don't really fully understand or know. But if we can feel that the mind is the body, is the world that we perceive, and is our inner sensations of feelings and ideas and emotions, etc., then when we're doing yoga asanas, we are working with the vrittis which have manifested as the body. Correct. And now we are beginning to mold them into a shape that we want them to be in. And when we practice a compassionate or loving or selfless act, we're molding the vrittis of how we interact with the world around us. So in very simple ways, we can influence this field, and it's not so far away. I really like that. So Patanjali says, yogas chitta vritti nirodha, as you defined it. And then what happens after that has occurred? What happens when you have quieted all of these activities in this entangled field? Then tada drashtahu, the seer, swarupe avasthanam. Avasthanam means to dwell or remains as swarupa, its own form, and not as the other form. So tada drashtahu, then the seer remains established in its own self and not otherwise.
I see. So that is the self. The swarupa that is left is the self, right?
Drashtahu, the seer.
Right. That's the seer. So we basically, the fluctuations, the vrittis are the process that give rise to the scenery. And once the vrittis die down, the scenery disappears, and what's left is the seer. And the scenery is ever changing, but the seer is immutable, immortal, infinite, timeless, spaceless, formless, irreducible, and as we said, infinite. And that's who you are. And that leads to this word that you use, kaivalya or moksha. So please explain these two words as well.
Well, what we were going to do and what you had suggested was that we go through one of the things that Patanjali is very well known for, of course, is the 8 limbs of yoga, the Ashtanga yoga, and also Kriya yoga. And so you had suggested that when we discuss the formulation of Ashtanga yoga, we start at the end and not at the beginning. We don't start with yama and niyama, the personal observances, because those are hard to understand without the reference point of consciousness, of pure consciousness. So you said, let's start at the end. So, and samadhi is the eighth limb, and that's the last limb, but it's not the end goal of yoga. The end goal of yoga is kaivalya or moksha, and samadhi is a stepping stone towards this kaivalya. And so the kaivalya is the highest attainment when the self remains in itself as the self alone. And that's one of the best ways to put it. That's what happens in kaivalya and moksha. The self remains in itself as the self alone, as absolute consciousness, and it's not disturbed and doesn't change into anything else.
And that is liberation, that is also moksha, that is freedom from all conditioning, that's infinite possibilities, all of that, right? Self-realization.
Yes.
So we had agreed that we would look at all the eight limbs of yoga. And classically, the approach has been yama, niyama, asana, pranayam, pratyahara, dharana, dhyan, samadhi, and then moksha, right? Or kaivalya. But we decided that we'd actually explore the top-down approach. So samadhi is transcendence, right? And therefore, the window to that samadhi is the gap between every experience, is how I was programmed or indoctrinated into the yoga tradition by Maharishi, that the gap between sensation, the gap between perception, the gap between thought, the gap between breath, the gap between any space, you and me right now, there's a space, a perceptual gap. And this gap is kind of the window to that world, which is transcendent, the world of samadhi. Is that a good starting point for understanding the corridor, the window, is between every vritti, there is a still point. And, what is really happening in creation itself is that consciousness, which is at the level of samadhi, wants to have an experience. And because it wants, you say, why does it want to have an experience? The answer is, I guess the business of consciousness is to be conscious. The business of consciousness is to be conscious. And the only way it can be conscious of itself is through generation of vrittis. And this generation through vrittis creates an artificial subject-object split. So consciousness knows itself as me, the body-mind, and the other. So this me, consciousness knows itself right now as the provisional Deepak Chopra, and then it knows Eddie as the other, as the provisional Eddie Stern. And there are many other provisional identities right now experiencing me and the other. And that is because consciousness is becoming conscious of itself as me and the other. And then the vrittis kind of get entangled and create the whole matrix of qualia that is projecting as the universe. But when they're quietened down, there is no me, there is no other. There's the absolute identity that is differentiating, not even separating, differentiating into not only me, but innumerable others. Just like a stem cell differentiates into eyes and nose and liver and heart and kidney and brain and hair follicles and nails. And we say these are separate organs, but they're actually the same stem cell differentiated. So we are all sentient beings differentiated as biological organisms through the vrittis in absolute consciousness, Brahman. And once we recognize that, then there's spontaneous joy, there's spontaneous love, kindness, empathy, compassion, and also the loss of the fear of death, which is the essential religious experience is just those three things: samadhi, the emergence of platonic values like truth, goodness, beauty, harmony, love, compassion, joy, equanimity, not as moral dictates, but as natural outcomes of feeling entangled or connected or not separate but differentiated, and the loss of the fear of death, because consciousness being infinite is not subject to birth and death. Now, that's a huge promise that yoga is giving us right in the first sentence by Yog, or second sutra, Yog Chitti Nirodh. And we are starting right now with this doorway, which is, in fact, all of existence is continuously between vritti and that the source. Because between every vritti is that little window of silence between every vritti. Because I have a thought and I have a next thought, I have to go back to the source to get the next thought, whatever it is, or close to the source. So all this is a kind of a homeostatic mechanism where consciousness is by itself infinite, but in a sense unstable, because if it was stable, it would remain in samadhi. But because it fluctuates, it creates the universe. And so they go along. The vritti and the samadhi are kind of dancing together. And if that is a good entry point, then we can actually, for today, we can actually just summarize the first few sentences that you outlined for me when you sent me your notes. I have them in front of me. And so, you say here.
Wait, before you read from that, I want to just highlight two things you said that I think are really important. Number one, the idea of fluctuation. I was picking up on this when you first were starting to use the word fluctuation, that very often we think of a fluctuation as a bad thing. Like, oh, there's a fluctuation of a thought and I have to get rid of that fluctuation. But actually, a fluctuation is a characteristic of nature. Things go up and things go down. And so if we think of the fluctuation not as a negative and not even as a positive, but just a characteristic of nature, then we can navigate those fluctuations with ease and with grace and not get thrown off by them. So we maximize the inherent power of the fluctuation of nature as part of what gives rise and what falls. And so if a wave goes up in the ocean, you don't try to push that wave down. You let that wave express itself. It's going to come down, if you just let it do its thing and not get in the way. So I really like that idea of a fluctuation as this principle of nature. And then the other is when you were talking about, the nails and our liver and the stomach and the brain and our blood, and that they all come from the same stem cells, but they specialize into specialized functions, and they maintain those functions even though they come from the same source and the same splitting off of that, one sperm and ova joining together. So what happens when a cell begins not behaving like it's supposed to with its specialized function? I mean, as a doctor, what will happen if my liver cell decides not to behave like a liver cell, but do something else?
I would say that it's lost its memory of wholeness. It's lost its dharma. When I think of cancer cells, for example, cancer cells have lost the memory of death. In biology, we have a term called apoptosis, programmed cellular death. And so your stomach cells die every 5 days in order to renew your stomach cells so you can digest food. Your skin cells die once a month so the skin can remain relatively supple. The liver cells die every 3 months, on and on. Your immune cells die every 100 days or so, depending on lymphocytes, leukocytes, whatever. So death is built into the programming of cells as, I would say, vrittis. The vrittis fluctuate for a certain time. There's a program. and then it dies because memory needs to reincarnate itself. Memory here is how to digest food. Memory in the heart is how to pump blood, etc. Memory in the immune system is immune surveillance, etc. So every few days, memory is reincarnating as the dharma of that particular cell. When the cell loses its dharma, I'm using the example of cancer, then it goes on a quest of individual immortality, having lost its memory of wholeness. And that
At the
results
expense of the organism.
at the expense of the organism.
Yeah.
So our biology is part of the organism, which we call all sentient beings, which are projecting the experience of the universe collectively. The matrix of qualia is what we experience as the universe. But when a particular differentiated aspect of the totality has lost its memory of wholeness, that's disease. And yoga is to restore the memory of wholeness. And therefore, it's very important for us, at least for me, exploring non-dual realization, that everything we do with the body, the mind, and the perceptual experience of the world, personal relationships, social interactions, ultimately, they should all be to one purpose, samadhi. Okay.
Yeah, beautiful. And that's basically this analogy you gave was what I was going at with the cancer analogy, that every cell in our body serves the entirety of the organism, but maintains its specialized function. And therefore it's maintaining its purpose or its inherent purpose, which is dharma. There's a particular type of samadhi that Patanjali speaks about in chapter 4, which is the Dharma megha samadhi, the rain cloud of dharma. That at this final last, deep absorption into consciousness, we are flooded with this rain cloud of dharma or purpose, and becoming or embodying or the purpose not only of our existence, but of all existence, and living in harmony with that. So we might still have our specialized function of whatever karmas we need to play out, or the particular idiosyncrasies of our personality or of our body, whatever. But we exist for the purpose of serving the universal dharma, and not just our own greed, ambition, desires, whatever it might be. So all of the analogies you were leading up to that actually seems to fit in with this one particular type of samadhi, whereby we embody dharma and we live in harmony with the universal dharma called ritam at the same time, like a rain cloud, just nourishes and takes the heat away from the trials of existence. So that was beautiful. I think that in regards to what you said about samadhi as the gap,
the entry to samadhi as the gap.
As the gap, yeah, I think so, and the gap widens as the samadhi deepens. The gap widens so you can stay there for longer. So Patanjali, actually Vyasa, who's a commentator on the Yoga Sutras, explained that for the word samadhi, samadhi means a special type of concentration, and it's a characteristic of the mind already. It's not something special that we need to go find outside of ourselves. It's a characteristic that we already have. And we have 5 different states of mind. We have a very distracted state of mind where we can't even focus on anything for a moment. We have a completely obsessive state of mind where we just get stuck on something, or sometimes it's called a deluded state of mind. We have a semi-distracted state where sometimes we can focus and sometimes we can't. And Vyasa says this is the type of mind that a spiritual practitioner has. That if you won't come to yoga, meditation, or any of these types of practices, if you did not already have as sort of your baseline a semi-distracted state. Because in the first 2, you can't attain any concentration. You're not going to do something like this. It's going to be annoying, frustrating. So the semi-distracted state is the entry level. That's like somebody like me. And then the next state is ekagrata, or ekagra, where you can focus the mind on one point for as long as you want to. This is one-pointed concentration. And this is another special type of samadhi. And then after that comes niruddha. And niruddha is the completely arrested mind, where no vrittis arise, no fluctuations arise, no change occurs in that mind, unless the yogi decides to have a thought. And so if you look at someone like Ramana Maharshi, who he didn't have any fluctuations occurring in his mind, he was just pure consciousness, unless someone asked him a question and it required an answer, then he could pull up the necessary response. Otherwise, it was equilibrium. Nothing was happening. So the niruddha state is an absolutely arrested state of mind. And a thought only occurs if the yogi needs to have one for any particular reason, perhaps to serve humanity. Perhaps Maharishi Mahesh Yogi was like this, I don't know, but we do have examples of yogis through the ages who were like that and did that.
Maharishi had a lot of silence, and if you asked him a question, he would never respond immediately. He would stay in silence, and then when he spoke, it was as close as to the absolute truth you could hear. So he definitely embodied everything we're talking about. Eddie, we've gone for about 45 minutes almost. We've covered a lot of ground. I think this is a perfect way for our course to start. The course is called Yoga for Enlightenment, a course for modern adepts. And today we discuss the first two sutras, really, and the second more in detail, Yoga Chit Vritti Nirodh. And we started, as we have promised, from the top down, from samadhi, from transcendence, from the source. And so I would like to stop here. We'll just call it Yoga for Enlightenment, a course for modern adepts. And the first talk, we should just say top-down approach, if you like. And next time, we will start with all the different limbs in order. And I think we can talk about dhyan, dharana, pratyahara, pranayama, asana, niyama, yama. And it doesn't matter what order we take. Let's take the classic order now that we've understood that samadhi is both the alpha and the omega of the course, right? It is the beginning and the end. As T.S. Eliot said, we shall not cease from exploration. The end of our exploring is to arrive where we started from and know the place for the first time. So we've begun our journey from here to here. And I'm so grateful. Do you have any concluding words? I think what you said in these notes that you sent to me, this 6 point, when Nirodha has been attained, what happens? Do you want to just recite the first three sutras, or the first two sutras?
Yes,
as conclude?
Sure. So the first sutra is Atta Yoga Anushasanam, or you can say Atta Yoga Anushasanam, Yogash Chitta Vritti Nirodhaha, Tada Drashtuhu Swarupe Avasthanam. And that's what we covered today.
And those same, can you sound it out again in that beautiful melodious chant of yours and give the English translation, and we'll stop after that.
Yes, so Atta Yoganushasanam. Now begins the systematic explanation of yoga. Yogash Chitta Vritti Nirodhaha. Yoga is the selective elimination or the stilling of the activities in the field of chitta, or the field of mind, or the field of modified consciousness. Tada drashtuhu swarupe avasthanam. Then, when the mind is completely stilled, the self remains in its own form as the self alone.
Lesson 1, Yoga for Enlightenment, a course for modern adepts. With whether he likes it or not, he is a Yogi Raj. Eddie Stone. Thank you, Eddie.
And if you're going to call me Yogi Raj, then what am I going to call you? Vaidya Raj.
I don't know. Just call me Deepak.
Okay.
Okay. Okay. Thank you, Eddie. Thank you.
Thank you.
Jai Gurudev, as they say.
Hey, Gurudev.